That's a wrap. It's the end of 1987 on Segaiden episode 51.
You're going the wrong way! What?
Two episodes ago, we had Great Golf, a game that truly deserved its title. And now we arrive at Great Soccer, a game that also has an appropriate title, though for different reasons.
Great can mean enlarged, and in olden times was used as a euphemism for pregnancy. And putting Great Soccer into your Master System amounts to an act of husbandry, as your console gives birth to an entire litter of disappointment. I will say that, to its credit, Master System's Great Soccer does play better than the 1985 Mark III title by the same name. Just to clarify, this Great Soccer shipped in Japan and Europe as World Soccer, meaning its confusing Great moniker only applied to the American release. And this is a brief, meager take on the sport. Again, it plays better than the older Great Soccer, which appeared to be little more than a visual overlay for the SG-1000 game Champion Soccer. But it doesn't play as much better as you might expect, given how much Sega's 8-bit output had grown in confidence and sophistication over the course of the 2 years that separate these releases. I suppose it's just as well that the sports pad accessory didn't ship in Europe. Japan saw an alternate release of Great/World Soccer called Sports Pad Soccer. If that had made it to Europe, they might have called it Sports Pad Football, a title already fraught with confusion due to the bizarre dual release Great Football received in the US. Anyway, this Great Soccer makes the transition from the previous game's vertical field layout to the horizontal layout that had become more common in the genre by this point. This makes it look and play unmistakably similarly to Nintendo's Soccer for NES. Sadly, I can't say it plays better than that game, which I must reluctantly remind you shipped back in 1985, even before the clunky original Mark III Great Soccer debuted. Even so, it unquestionably tops that original Great Soccer, and outshines every other console soccer game available at the time of its launch in all regions, except NES Soccer. Admittedly, that only accounts for leftover 2600 games, and Super Soccer for Epoch Cassette Vision, so it's not a terribly high bar to clear. The soccer genre would explode on Famicom in 1988, with no less than 3 different releases including Goal by Jaleco, and the legendary Captain Tsubasa hitting in quick succession. Great Soccer's greatest strength was honestly that it just didn't have much competition. The action works reasonably well. Play still has a bit of a choppy field, with players and the ball seemingly snapping into predetermined spaces rather than moving fluidly, although not as severely as in the original Great Soccer. This leads me to wonder if Great Soccer employs some of Space Harrier's background tile animation chicanery in order to present 2 entire teams of players on the pitch at a given time. If so, it does a better job of obscuring that fact than Space Harrier did. More important than the characters moving more smoothly than in the original Great Soccer, this game does a vastly better job of designating active fielder control and intelligently switching control based on the current position of the ball and the players. Unlike, say, Great Volleyball and the infuriating chaos of its automated active team member selection, Great Soccer always makes you feel like you're directing the actions of the character you want to take the lead. It accomplishes this, in part, by giving you control of multiple players at once, but it does it in such a way that you don't direct every team member simultaneously, which would reduce this to a glorified take on foosball. This might be the most minimalist soccer sim on any post-crash system. The game lacks on-screen indicators for things like the score or time left in the current half, stripping down the interface visuals to the active player indicator arrow icon. As soccer sims go, it's fine. For 1987, you could barely do better or worse. Great Soccer had the field more or less to itself in the US, which made it a tolerable option until more interesting soccer titles made their way into stores. Anyway, the important thing is that this marks the last time Sega would publish a game specifically designated for use with a sports pad. Not that this would be the end of Master System's confusion over peripherals.
Alas, 1987 ends not with 1, but with 2 sports titles not deserving the Great moniker. After Great Soccer, Sega also slopped Great Basketball onto our poor, undeserving lunch trays.
I can only describe Great Basketball as startlingly bad. It may not be the worst sports game I've ever played, but we're talking about late 1987 here. Expectations for this genre had been readjusted by this point. The likes of Atari Basketball, or even One-on-One, felt awfully dated here in a post-double dribble world, And great basketball doesn't have what it takes to stand up to the competition. Oh, it starts well enough. You can select one of 8 teams for yourself and your opponent to face off in the pleasantly brief competition. Great basketball breaks its game into 2 halves, not quarters, that take about 4 minutes apiece to complete, meaning that this experience at least has the good grace not to overstay its welcome. Or does it? Honestly, great basketball feels awful in motion, with poor team and player management. Even an 8-minute session of this feels like entirely too much. Great basketball suffers from that most tragic bugbear of team-based games: poor automation. You have too little control over which player the CPU highlights as your active participant, which makes the entire experience feel haphazard. A shame, since Great Soccer actually managed to get that right. Controlling your active player feels no better. The game's inputs have a sticky quality to them, which results in all sorts of issues, like accidentally traveling when attempting to shoot. Even the simple act of running around the court can be infuriating, as the overly sensitive collision detection will cause you to commit accidental fouls when you move too close to an opponent. Even once you do figure out the timing and mechanics of play, such as the fact that stealing the ball boils down to staying slightly ahead of the player who currently has possession and moving around erratically until the ball just decides to transfer to your control. The computer takes a wildly arbitrary approach to determining whether or not you have successfully sunk the ball into the net. 4 times out of 5, the answer is that you have not. The only thing great basketball really has going for it is that the CPU-controlled players seem to control every bit as poorly as your own. This leads to hilariously low-scoring games whose final results look more like a baseball game or hockey match than something out of the NBA. Weirdly, if you manage to win against the computer, the game doesn't seem to recognize your victory unless you can hit a post-game free throw. I have no idea what happens if you do make one of these shots because, once again, great basketball just absolutely refuses to let you hit the net. In an even weirder twist, the game also allows you to allocate skill points to various stats for your team after a match, enhancing your team's abilities. It's not a bad idea, but so far as I can tell, great basketball lacks any sort of save or password system, so these upgrades only persist for as long as you can stand to continue powering through a single play session. Quite a bold assumption for a basketball sim this mediocre.
But take heart. The finale of 1987 isn't all about bad to middling sports games. No, Sega ended the year with an FM unit enhanced grace note in the form of Phantasy Star 2, a Master System sequel to an arcade hit.
I mentioned last episode that you could see Sega's development staff making an active effort to recalibrate their design approach for home consoles in Zillion. We wrap up 1987's releases with Fantasy Zone 2, which demonstrates some of these collective baby steps as well. No, it doesn't have a save or continue feature, let's not be ridiculous here, but it does contain a more complex structure than the original Fantasy Zone. It offers the player a greater sense of agency, and it contains more hidden secrets and features. On a basic level, it plays largely the same as the original. You control Opa Opa, a cute little guy who flies around shooting and bombing things like a primary colored egg reskin of the fighter from Konami's Scramble. However, rather than traversing a linear path like the Scramble fighter, Opa Opa moves freely in both directions through an infinite loop that works like it's laminated to the outside of a cylinder. Or, to be more accurate, it works like the stage design in Williams' Defender. The core gameplay loop here consists of blowing apart stationary enemies that spawn smaller enemies, a feature that Capcom would rip off wholesale a year later with the air tikis in Mega Man 2's Airman stage. Here, the bases vary in appearance from level to level and generate different kinds of spawn to match. The one thing they all have in common is that they soak up a ton of damage, and you need to blow them all to pieces in order to advance to the stage boss and move along to the next round. And as in the original Fantasy Zone, certain enemies or enemy formations drop cash when destroyed, which Opa Opa can collect to spend on weapons in the shops located throughout each stage. All the while, wave after wave of Zako enemies fly across the screen in increasingly aggravating patterns, and a single unlucky collision will knock you out of the action. It's a fast-paced, unrelenting take on the shooter whose charming visuals obscure hardcore difficulty. So it's essentially the same experience as the original Fantasy Zone if you just look at the broad strokes. Once you begin to examine the details more closely, however, you can see a lot of small differences that add up to a unique overall experience. The big change is that stages no longer consist of single infinitely scrolling space, but rather 3 infinitely scrolling spaces. Now you may be saying to yourself, itself, by the very definition of infinite, it should be impossible to have 3 infinite spaces in a single location. And you're not wrong, you internet pedant you, but you have failed to take into account the existence of warps that defy Euclidean physics. Yes, while most enemy generator bases drop a paper bill worth 500 currency units when destroyed, 2 bases in each loop instead reveal warp portals when destroyed. Flying into one of these warps takes you to a new section of the current stage, where you need to take out an entirely separate fleet of enemy generators. All told, each stage contains 3 of these sections, all interconnected through warp portals. You have to destroy all the bases from all 3 sections before you can advance to the next round, which makes this a much larger and more demanding game than the original Fantasy Zone. However, it also offers more freedom. You can warp between sections anytime you like, and on top of that you can also visit the in-game shop anytime you like. The shop itself now exists as a permanent fixed installation in one section of each stage, rather than showing up unexpectedly as a moving object that wastes no time scarpering off the screen. Each shop appears to have a smaller fixed inventory too, which means that, for example, you can only purchase certain items in certain stages. The weapons this time around largely carry over from the first Fantasy Zone, and they work more or less the same way. Speed boosts last until you lose a life, upgraded guns run on a short timer before running out, and bombs appear as limited inventory items. The new permanence to weapon shop locations means that you can, for example, duck into a shop after clearing out all the enemy bases, buy a weapons upgrade, and immediately dash to the boss's lair to take it on with enhanced power. You have a little more agency over your boss encounters this time as well. Unlike in the first Fantasy Zone, where bosses dissolved onto the screen the moment you took out the final enemy generator, Fantasy Zone 2 puts them behind warp portals as well. These portals are easy to spot since they look like stop signs. Like shops, they appear in fixed locations in each stage, although unlike shops, you can't travel through one of these warps until you clear out all 3 zones of the current stage of all enemy bases. The bosses attack you with even more varied tactics than in the original Fantasy Zone. The first boss, for example, doesn't shoot at you, but rather flies around harmlessly while forcing you to dodge a vast array of logs that it summons into reality. And as you have surely come to expect by now, Fantasy Zone 2 is every bit as brutal as any game Sega has ever produced. It contains a total of 8 levels, but surviving past the 3rd round demands real grit and determination. But as I mentioned during Opa Opa's previous appearance, the last episode where he showed up as a power-up icon and mascot for Zillion, Sega began to pivot toward console-oriented design in 1987. It was a slow pivot, admittedly, but you have to respect the effort. In this case, that pivot manifests not only in the more complex level structures you have to navigate, but also in the fact that Fantasy Zone 2 is slightly more forgiving than its predecessor. The collision detection gives Opa Opa a teeny tiny hitbox, which makes it possible for the little guy to squeeze through some incredibly tight situations safely. Not only that, but Opa Opa now has a life bar. Now, this isn't quite the generous boon that it might sound like. It works like the one in Namco's Rolling Thunder, allowing you to safely shrug off a hit from a single enemy projectile, but not protecting you from direct impacts with bad guys. However, you can actually acquire permanent power-ups this time around. These are all hidden with ruthless efficiency throughout the game in the most nondescript areas imaginable, and your only clue to their presence is the fact that sometimes your bullets will appear to hit nothing in midair, as if you're actually paying attention to what your bullets do, while juking and dodging desperately to avoid the increasingly erratic patterns of infinite Zako waves. These hidden power-ups confer permanent bonuses to Opa Opa, including extensions of his health meter, and, most preciously, a clock that grants greater duration for his sub-weapon timer. Still, even if you manage to dig up these extras, Fantasy Zone 2 takes no prisoners, a console game that bears its arcade teeth with enthusiasm. But it's a fine successor to the original game. In fact, developer M2 liked it so much that they backported Fantasy Zone 2 to the System 1 hardware years later, creating something that plays like an arcade version drawn from a parallel reality. Fantasy Zone 2W, as they called that version, has shown up several times throughout the years, most notably as a standalone Sega Ages release for Nintendo 3DS. I'd say you should definitely buy a copy, but alas, Nintendo don't keep its digital storefronts open anymore.
Now, you may be wondering what Sega's in-house publications had to say about these games, especially the masterful Fantasy Zone 2, and the answer is nothing. However, Opa Opa did receive just a little bit of publicity in the form of a mail-in promotion in the magazine's 2nd issue.
Sega sold the Rapid Fire Unit peripheral as a mail-in offer for Team Sega readers in its early issues. A pass-through cable connector, the Rapid Fire Unit hooked into your setup by plugging into the controller port and linking your controller to the console. By flipping switches on the unit, you could activate rapid-fire commands for each of the controller buttons individually. While perhaps a less elegant solution than the turbo switches built into the NES Advantage, which Nintendo shipped around the same time, the Rapid Fire Unit did have the benefit of working with a standard D-pad instead of requiring you to use a joystick. Of course, if you wanted integrated Rapid Fire, there was that Sega Sports Pad that wouldn't see official support in any future releases. Not that its obsolescence prevented Team Sega from running a puff piece about it in early 1988.
Next time on Segaiden, a coda for 1987 with a look at Mark III's Japan-exclusive titles for the year.